Oh, these little liars. I told y'all that Jax was the ringleader. I told y'all. He sat in this interview and he was telling stories about shit that he wasn't even there to witness. So let's break down some of the stuff that I heard in this interview. Let's start with Warren's first phone call, because y'all will remember that Warren said that he was over at Ava's house for that 4th of July party when they all started realizing that Nolan was missing, and he called Miss Christine at 11 o'clock. And yesterday, the same time that this interview came out, Christine Wells said this.
360 says that he's on land, and he was like, well, no, I mean, when we have his phone.
So both versions of the story say that Warren didn't tell her about the phone until after she confronted him with the 360.
Here is the truth. All evidence laid out is saying Nolan was killed by his friends, people he trusted, 2 autopsies, 2 separate examiners, one paid for by the state of Mississippi, one paid for out of a mother's own pocket, because she didn't trust the state to give her the truth. Both reports came back with the exact same word. A call comes in to a private marine towing company, not the Coast Guard, a towing service. The young man on the line is panicked. He tells the dispatcher their bilge pump has failed. Water is coming in. He can't answer basic questions clearly. When the dispatcher asks how many people are on board, he can't give a straight number. Then, just as help is being arranged, the call is cancelled. A relative reaches the towing company directly and says the situation has been handled. At 4:31, GPS records show the boat leaving the island. Nolan does not leave with it. The district attorney says the report will stay sealed until it's presented to a grand jury, calling it standard procedure for any death in the county that isn't ruled natural. Maybe that's true. But standard procedure doesn't explain why, in the middle of all this silence, a fake toxicology report starts circulating online, one convincing enough that Mississippi's own Department of Public Safety has to step in and publicly call it a fraud. Real answers locked away, fake ones spreading in their place. And underneath all of it sits the one piece of information that should have settled everything, and hasn't. This case is heavy. It involves the death of a teenager, a report that's remained sealed for weeks, and a family still waiting on answers most of us would never have the strength to wait for. If you're still here, hit subscribe, and tell me down in the comments where you're watching from. Because what happened here took place in broad daylight, in front of hundreds of witnesses, and 6 weeks later, almost none of it adds up. Let's get straight into it. That afternoon, the island was filled with people, somewhere between 200 and 300 of them. Many former classmates, all of them there for the same simple reason. A holiday, a group of friends, a day on the water that had no reason to be remembered as anything other than ordinary. Then, at around 4 o'clock that afternoon, the day took its first documented turn. A call came through to Sea-Tow, a private marine towing company, not a government agency, not the Coast Guard. A company boaters call the same way you'd call a tow truck for a car stalled on the highway, for help when a hull takes on water and a boat can't get itself home. That distinction matters, because in the weeks since, it has become one of the most misunderstood details in the entire case, folded again and again into a version of events that doesn't quite match what actually happened. On the recording, later obtained and released by state officials, a young man's voice comes through the line, tense and rushed. He tells the dispatcher their bilge pump has failed, that water is coming in, that they need help. When the dispatcher tries to gauge how serious the situation is, his answers come back unclear, almost scattered. The kind of answers that suggest someone is more frightened than they are able to fully explain. Asked whether everyone aboard is safe, he says yes, everyone is accounted for. The exchange grows harder to follow from there. Asked for towing membership information, he doesn't have an answer ready. He does manage to relay the boat's coordinates, placing the vessel near the island's northwestern tip. When the dispatcher asks how many people are on board, his response is confusing enough that she has to ask again, more plainly this time, for an exact number. Eventually, one comes through. 7. He asks for the boat to be stabilized and towed back to a mainland launch point known as Fort Bayou. And then, before Sea-Tow can act on any of it, the situation shifts again. The towing captain, working to coordinate a response, places a separate call, not to the boat, but to the operator's grandfather. According to the captain's own account of that conversation, the grandfather says the problem has already been resolved. No tow is necessary. As far as Cito's own records are concerned, the call ends there, closed out before a single boat is ever sent. At 4:31 that afternoon, GPS tracking confirms the vessel is moving again, leaving the island, heading back toward the mainland. Nolan Wells is not aboard it. A retired federal investigator who later reviewed this recording said publicly that he heard nothing in it beyond a group of frightened young people dealing with a mechanical failure, nothing more sinister than that. And taken entirely on its own, that may well be exactly what it was. But strip away every layer of interpretation, and here is what remains. A boat in distress, a call for help that's cancelled before help ever arrives, and a GPS marker, 4:31 in the afternoon, that stands to this day as the last confirmed moment that vessel is known to have been moving as one complete group. Whatever happened to Nolan Wells after that moment happened somewhere the GPS data simply doesn't reach, and somewhere in that gap sits an entire family's worth of unanswered questions. He wasn't a stranger to the people on that island that day. He'd grown up alongside most of them in the same small, tightly woven stretch of the Mississippi coast, the kind of community where everyone's names are familiar before they're ever introduced. 3 of those names would go on to dominate this case for the next 6 weeks: Warren Hudson, Jax Pitalo, Morgan Seymour. In the days after Nolan's body was found, all 3 began appearing across social media, not as witnesses being carefully questioned by investigators, but as targets, accused, without confirmation from anyone in law enforcement, of knowing more than they'd said, or of covering something up entirely. It's worth pausing on what that actually means. 3 young men, all under 20, all connected to someone they'd grown up with, watching their names become shorthand for suspicion online, faster than any official process could confirm or deny anything about them. By early August, the pressure on their families had grown severe enough that they turned to legal counsel. Mississippi attorney J. Tyler Cox took the case first. He was soon joined by Edward Andrew Paltzik, a media law and defamation attorney with a national profile, who had previously represented Donald Trump in matters involving press coverage and public reputation. Around the same time, Warren Hudson's father set up a legal defense fund, describing it publicly as a fight to protect his son's future and the futures of the 2 young men standing beside him. Cox spoke to local reporters in blunt, protective terms, describing the 3 of them as good people from Ocean Springs who didn't deserve what was happening to them online. Their formal statement, issued jointly through their attorneys, didn't hedge. They said plainly that they didn't know how Nolan Wells died, but in the very same breath, they stated, with total certainty, that Warren, Jax, and Morgan had nothing whatsoever to do with it. An admission of not knowing, paired with an assertion of complete innocence, delivered together. Their legal team went further still, warning publicly that anyone continuing to spread false claims about their clients could expect to be pursued for defamation in court. On August 7th, Warren Hudson and Jax Pitalo returned to Horn Island itself, accompanied by their attorneys, in what Cox described as an effort to understand the layout and the dynamics of that day firsthand. Morgan Seymour didn't join them, kept away by prior school obligations. According to Cox, the visit was difficult for both young men, the island being the last place either of them had seen their friend alive. At one point, the group paused near the location where Nolan's body was eventually found. Cox described both of them as visibly shaken in that moment, needing time before they could continue walking the shoreline. 4 days later, on August 11th, all 3 sat together for a televised interview, describing weeks of scrutiny, threats, and what Hudson called an inability to move through public spaces without feeling watched. Pitalo said the past month had completely upended his life. At one point, one of them reflected on the day itself, saying simply that he wished they'd never gone out on the water that 4th of July, a line that, on its surface, reads as regret over how the day ended, rather than an admission of anything specific. Their attorney, seated with them throughout, held the same position his team had maintained from the beginning, that his clients had no connection to what happened to Nolan Wells. In a separate statement to press, he went further, saying his team had identified witnesses who placed Nolan on the island hours after his clients had already left, a claim that, if accurate, would meaningfully shift the timeline as it's currently understood, though it remains, for now, an assertion from the defense, not a finding confirmed by any investigator. None of these statements, from the three young men or from the legal team representing them, have been independently verified. They remain public statements made under intense public pressure, not conclusions reached by law enforcement or by any completed investigation. It's worth holding both things at once: real grief, expressed by young people who say they lost a friend, sitting alongside a legal defense built specifically to counter suspicion that has never been confirmed one way or the other. What has been verified, in far more concrete terms, is what the two separate autopsies on Nolan Wells actually found, and it's worth slowing down here, because this is the part of the case built on something more solid than accusation or defense. This is what the evidence itself says. Both examinations, the official one conducted by the state and the independent one commissioned by his family, arrived at the exact same conclusion: undetermined, not ruled an accident, not ruled a crime. The same unresolved word, reached independently by two examiners who never worked together, weeks apart. The state's official findings have never been made public. They remain sealed, known only to the small circle of people with legal access to them. The independent autopsy, however, conducted by forensic pathologist Dr. Roger Mitchell, did produce specific findings, and these remain the single most concrete piece of physical evidence connected to this entire case. Mitchell noted a discoloration on the back of Nolan's head. He described it, in his own words, as inconclusive on its own, but significant enough to warrant further investigation. 6 weeks later, that detail has never been publicly explained by anyone. Mitchell's report also noted something that shaped the entire scope of what he was able to determine. By the time the body reached him for the independent exam, certain tissue in the neck area had already been examined during the earlier state autopsy, and was no longer available for his own review. That limitation meant he couldn't fully evaluate that part of the body. In his own written findings, Mitchell stated he could not rule out that an injury to the neck played some role in Nolan's death, not because he found evidence that it did, but because there simply wasn't enough left for him to determine it either way. Forensic experts who reviewed the case afterward pointed out that this kind of limitation isn't unusual. A second autopsy, performed after a first has already taken place, almost never has access to a body in its original state, and independent examiners frequently work with less information than the initial team had. Mitchell's own report acknowledged this directly, noting that advanced decomposition and the prior state examination significantly limited what conclusions could be drawn. So here is where the physical evidence actually stands. Two examiners, two separate reports, the same unresolved word sitting at the bottom of both. A mark on the back of his head that no one, not the state, not the independent examiner, not anyone connected to this case, has been able to explain. And a portion of his body that was already gone by the time anyone got a second chance to look at it. For his mother, this is what 6 weeks of waiting has produced. Not an answer. Not even the beginning of one. Just 2 words, written twice, in 2 different offices, by 2 people who never spoke to each other. If you want to understand how this case has continued to unfold since then, through the sealed report and everything that surfaced online in its place, stay with me, because that's exactly where this goes next. By the end of July, the state's official autopsy on Nolan Wells was complete, and yet, as August began, none of it had reached the public. Not the findings, not a cause of death, not a single page of what that report actually says. That decision has a name attached to it: Jackson County District Attorney Angel Myers McElrath. On July 23rd, she addressed the case directly, choosing to explain her office's position publicly rather than let the silence speak for itself. Her reasoning was procedural. Every death investigated in the county, she said, aside from those ruled to be from natural causes or non-criminal accidents, is presented to a grand jury before any findings are released. It isn't a rule created for this case, And it isn't something applied differently because of how much attention the story has drawn. According to McElrath, this is simply how her office has handled every death investigation throughout her entire career, long before anyone outside that county had ever heard the name Nolan Wells. Once the broader investigation concludes, the case materials, autopsy report included, will go before that grand jury, whose role is to determine whether a crime occurred. Only after that review can any of the findings become public. It's a policy rooted in long-standing legal procedure, not something designed specifically to withhold information from this family. But procedure, however standard, doesn't soften what it feels like on the other side of it. Later that same month, on July 22nd, Nolan's parents, Christine and Elmore, stood before cameras at the Narkeeps National Convention in Chicago, flanked by their attorney, sharing what they knew and what they still didn't. It's a strange, painful kind of public role to be pushed into, grieving parents, standing at a podium, hoping a national platform might do what 6 weeks of local process hadn't. A mother has now waited well over a month for a report that already exists, finished, sitting in an office, its contents known to a handful of people, and to no one else, including her. And into that exact silence, something else began to spread. In early August, a document began circulating across social media, presented as Nolan Wells' official toxicology report. It looked authentic. It was formatted the way a real forensic document would be. It spread quickly, shared by people who had no reason to doubt what they were looking at, treated by many as the missing piece the investigation had failed to provide. It wasn't real. Russell Latino, an attorney representing another young man connected to the case, was among the first to say so publicly. He posted directly, stating plainly that the results circulating online were fabricated and that no real findings from either autopsy had ever been released to anyone outside the investigation. He didn't stop at correcting the record. He addressed the broader pattern building around this case, saying, in his own words, that someone's death should not be treated as entertainment. His warning didn't stay isolated. Mississippi's Department of Public Safety Commissioner, Sean Tyndall, backed it with the full weight of his office, confirming publicly that the document was fraudulent and describing what was happening as a dangerous mix of bad actors, artificial intelligence, and social media moving faster than the truth ever could. He said Nolan Wells, his family, and everyone connected to this case deserved better than what was happening to it online. This distinction is worth being precise about. A fake toxicology report did circulate. It appears to have been built, at least partly, using AI tools capable of producing convincing fraudulent documents. And it was confirmed as fake, publicly and officially, not by online commentators trying to out-argue each other, but by the state's own top safety official. What has never been confirmed by any official source is anything beyond that single document. The real toxicology results. The real findings from either autopsy. All of it remains exactly where it's been for weeks, sealed inside a file that only a grand jury has the legal authority to open. It also wasn't only misinformation that spread. As theories multiplied online, so did threats, directed not just at the 3 young men, but at people around them entirely removed from that boat. Warren Hudson's stepmother, a sitting judge, publicly said threats had been made against her entire family, including young children who had nothing to do with any of this. Separately, a man was arrested after authorities said he made threats against a public official connected to the case. None of this brings anyone closer to knowing what happened to Nolan. It only adds more names to the list of people this case has quietly damaged along the way. Which leaves this exactly where it stood since early July, only heavier now, with more layers added to it. A completed report the public still isn't permitted to see, a legal process moving forward on a timeline no one outside the investigation controls, a fabricated document convincing enough that the state itself had to step in and publicly tell people not to trust it, and a mother who stood in front of a national audience in Chicago 3 weeks ago now, still without the one thing she actually needs, which isn't attention, and isn't sympathy, and isn't a viral moment. It's an answer. 6 weeks, 2 autopsies, 1 sealed report, a fake one circulating in its place. A boy who told his mother he loved her on his way out the door and never got the chance to come back through it. That's where this case stands right now. If this is a story you want to keep following, make sure you're subscribed, because there's more still to uncover. And the next part is where it goes even deeper.